Vanakkam, good morning. In this video, we are going to discuss about the cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is the important long question from the cardiovascular system. In this video, we are going to briefly discuss about the cardiac cycle. The sequence of electrical and mechanical events occurring in heart during a single beat is the cardiac cycle. In the cardiac cycle, we have to discuss about the pressures in the ventricle and aorta and atrium and aortic blood flow, ventricular volume, electrocardiogram activities and phonocardiogram activities and phlebogram activities, everything discussed in the cardiac cycle. Normal average duration of the cardiac cycle is the 0.8 second when the heartbeat is normal. So in the 0.8 second, 0.1 second is the atrial systole, remaining 0.7 second is the atrial diastole. Ventricle systole is the 0.3 second, remaining 0.5 second is the ventricle diastole. So atrial systole is 0.1 second. So it is begins with the peak of P wave in the electrocardiogram and ends with the QRS complex, atrial systole. So during the atrial systole, atria is contract, it pushes the blood to the ventricle. So it only contributes the 20% of the ventricular filling actively. This actively pumps the blood into the ventricle 20%. 80% of the ventricular filling occur passively. Okay. So atrial systole contribute only 20% less compared to the passive. So but during the exercise and during the tachycardia, the diastole duration is decreased. So that time the atrial systole is important for filling the ventricle. So that time the atrial systole contribute more amount of filling to the ventricle. That time more cardiac output is needed. Okay. Ventricle volume increases mildly during the atrial systole. Little bit is increased. Atrial pressure rises. So during the atrial contraction, atrial pressure rises. It produces the A wave in the jugular venous pulse curve. That is called as the phlebogram. Recording of waves in the jugular venous pulse is called as the phlebogram. So that is A wave seen in the JVP curve. And the atrial pressures exceeds the ventricular pressure. Fourth heart sound is heard during the atrial systole. It is due to the inflow of the blood from the atria to the ventricle. It produces a fourth heart sound in the phonocardiogram. Recording of the heart sound is called as the phonocardiogram. Mitral valve close at the end of the atrial system. So mitral valve is closed. So that time ventricular pressure exceeds the atrial pressure. Mitral valve close at the end of the atrial systole. Atrial diastole occurs during the ventricular systole, coincide with the ventricular systole. During the ventricular systole, bulging of the atrioventricular valve into the atrium, it produces the C wave in the jugular venous pulse. So in the atrial diastole, C wave seen in the JVP due to the bulging of the atrioventricular valve into the atrium during the beginning of ventricular systole. During the atrial diastole, venous return increases, atrial volume and pressure also increases. It produces the V wave in the JVP. The duration of the atrial diastole is 0.7 seconds. 7 seconds. So, atrial systole is only 0.1 second. Ventricular systole is again divided into the isovolumetric contraction phase. It is less duration, 0.05 second, and rapid ejection phase. It is around 0.10 second, and reduced ejection phase, it is the longest duration, 0.15 second. So ventricular systole is average duration is the 3 second. So in the isovolumetric contraction, the no change in the ventricular volume. Okay, assume, and it starts with the peak of QRS complex in electrocardiogram. It is started with the closing of the mitral valve. So closing of the mitral valve and tricuspid valve produces the first heart sound. So first heart sound also appear in this phase, isovolumetric contraction phase. So all the valves are closed, it contracts. The volume is no changed, but the ventricular pressure is increases during the isovolumetric contraction phase. So the ventricular pressure increases 0 to 8 millimeter, 80 millimeter mercury in the left ventricle and 0 to 8 millimeter mercury in the right ventricle. So the pressure is sharply increased, but no change in the ventricular volume and aortic blood flow because all the valves are closed state. Okay, so all the valves are remain closed state and ends with the opening of the semilunar valves. Isovolumetric contraction is ends with the opening of the aortic and pulmonary valve. So it is important for the increasing the ventricular pressure in spite of no change in the ventricular volume. So rapid ejection phase occur after the isovolumetric contraction phase. During the isovolumetric contraction phase, the more tensions are developed within the ventricle. It tries to open the aortic valve. Start with the opening of the aortic valve. So more blood is ejected through the left ventricle to the aorta, like that right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. So it steeply increases the aortic blood flow. And steep fall occur in the ventricular volume. So when the more blood is passed through the aorta, automatically ventricular volume is drastically decreases. Ventricular pressure is increases. Instead of increasing aortic pressure, ventricular pressure during the rapid ejection phase is more than the aortic pressure. Okay. So in the initial part is atrial pressure is falls due to the during the ventricular contraction the base of the heart is pushed away. So atrial pressure fall initially, then gradually the atrial pressure is increased due to the increased venous return. Venous return, the atrial pressure is gradually increases, and C wave is produced in the JVP. The C wave is produced due to the during the rapid ejection phase, the tricuspid valve is bulged inside the atrium. Okay, that produces the C wave in the JVP. The rapid ejection basis correspond to the ST segment in the electrocardiogram. Okay. Reduced ejection phase is the longest phase in the ventricular systole. The average duration of the reduced ejection phase is the 0.15 second. During the reduced ejection phase, ventricular and aortic pressure is decreases. In spite of decreasing both, aortic pressure is exceed the ventricular pressure. So when the aortic pressure is exceed the ventricular pressure, that time reduced ejection phase starts. Aortic blood flow is also greatly decreased during the reduced ejection phase. Ventricular volume is further decreased. Atrial pressure continued to increase slowly. It is due to the venous return increased in the atrium. So that slowly increases the atrial pressure. So in the electrocardiogram, the T wave appear in the reduced ejection phase. The reduced ejection phase is closed, ends with the closure of the aortic valve. Ventricular diastole is divided into the isovolumetric relaxation phase and rapid filling phase and reduced filling phase or diastasis. So during the isovolumetric contraction, both the atrioventricular valves and seminilar valves are closed. Rapid fall in the ventricular pressure. So relaxation is no change in the volume, but the relaxation of the ventricle is occur. So no change in ventricular volume. Aortic blood flow is almost nil. No blood flow in the aorta. Second heart sound is appear in this stage due to the closure of the semilunar valves. And atrial pressure continue to rise due to the increased venous return during the atrium. Okay, atrial diastole is coincide with the ventricular systole and diastole. 0.7 second is duration of the atrial diastole. So the atrial pressure rises, continue to rises during the isovolumetric relaxation phase also. The peak of P wave appear on the JVP due to the increased venous return in the atrium, right atrium. The isovolumetric relaxation phase ends with the opening of the mitral valve. So opening of the mitral valves closes the isovolumetric relaxation phase. Okay. The rapid filling phase of ventricular diastole is start with the opening of the mitral valve. So during the ventricular systole, the flood is filled in the atrium that is enter into the ventricle. So that rapidly increases the ventricular volume. Decrease in the ventricular and atrial pressure during the rapid filling phase due to the relaxation of the ventricle, and atrial pressure always just more than the ventricular pressure. During the flow of the blood from the atrium to ventricle, it produces a inrest flow that produces the third heart sound in the phonocardiogram. These are the events occurring during the rapid filling phase of the ventricular diastole. Diastasis, otherwise called as the reduced filling phase. Most of the ventricular filling is occur during the reduced filling phase and rapid filling phase. So during the reduced filling phase or diastasis, slow rise in the ventricular volume. Ventricular volume is slowly raised. No change in the left atrial, left ventricular aortic pressure. The P wave appear at the end of this phase, begins to appear at the end of this phase. These are the major events occurring during the diastasis or reduced filling phase. So 80% of the ventricular filling occur during the reduced filling phase and rapid filling phase. Only 20% of the ventricular filling is occur during the atrial systole. It is important during the tachycardia. So during the tachycardia, diastole duration is decreased. That time the atrial systole is important for ventricular filling. Otherwise, 80% of the ventricular filling occur during the rapid filling phase and diastasis or reduced filling phase. So cardiac cycle asks us short notes or long question. You have to draw this curve. So you have to practice the curve 2-3 times. Then only you can draw the curve properly in the examination. Okay. If you draw the curve correctly, means you can write the points very easily. So in the x-axis, depict the atrial systole. Ventricular systole is divided into the isometric contraction, isovolumetric contraction, rapid ejection, reduced ejection. Ventricular diastole divided into the isovolumetric relaxation and rapid filling phase and reduced filling phase. During the atrial systole, start with the P wave, ends at the starting of the QRS complex. Okay. So during the atrial systole, atrial pressure is increased. Atrial pressure is increased, and it produces the A wave in the jugular venous pulse. A wave in the jugular venous pulse, and fourth heart sound also produced in the atrial systole due to the inflow of the blood during the atrial systole. Only 20% of the filling is occur during the atrial systole, the ventricular filling. 80% is occur during the rapid filling and reduced filling. Okay, and ventricular pressure also same, and aortic pressure also flat in the during the atrial systole. So in the isovolumetric contraction phase, what happened? It is mitral valve is closed. Starting from the mitral valve is closed. Okay, so all the valves are mitral valve and seminal valves are closed. So it produces a contraction. It increases the left ventricular pressure from the 0 to 80 millimeter mercury. It increases from the 0 to 80 millimeter mercury, and it is also produces the aortic fluid flow is no change during this period. Ventricular volume also no change. The first heart sound is produced in the phonocardiogram due to the closure of the mitral valve, and the ECG it produces the QRS complex. Okay. So in the rapid ejection phase, it start from the AV valve open, atrioventricular valve, mainly mitral valve. Aortic valve open. Aortic valve is open, so blood is flow through the aorta. So here aortic blood flow is greatly increases. So here aortic pressure is increased, but the ventricular pressure is also increased during the rapid ejection phase. When it's over the rapid ejection phase, the aortic pressure is exceeds the ventricular pressure. Okay. So the C wave also produced during the rapid ejection phase due to the atrioventricular valve pulse towards the atrium. So it produces the C wave. C wave is produced during the rapid ejection phase, and the ventricular volume is drastically decreased during the rapid ejection phase. So the rapid ejection phases correspond to the ST segment of the ECG. It is correspond to the ST segment of ECG. So when it is entering into the then reduced ejection phase, it is slowly ventricular volume is decreased. Okay, the aortic pressure also exceeds, but aortic blood flow also decreased this phase. It is up to the aortic valve closed. Reduced ejection phases up to aortic valve closed. Initially in the left atrial pressure is gradually increases due to the filling of the atria during the ventricular systole. Aortic flow gradually greatly decreases, ventricular volume decreases, and here that this ends with the closure of the AV valves. Closure of the AV valves produces at the end it produces the second heart sound due to the closure of the AV valves. Okay. So in the ventricular diastole divided into the isometric relaxation base, rapid filling and reduced filling. During the isometric relaxation base, so when the AV valves close, it produces the aortic knots, and left ventricular pressure is also decreased, and atrial pressure also decreased, but the atrial pressure is more than the aortic pressure here. So both here atrial pressure is gradually increases. Okay, here ventricular pressure is decreased. Here no change in the ventricular volume. Here also ventricular volume is aortic fluid flow no change, ventricular volume also no change. It produces the V wave. V wave is due to the rapid inflow of the atrial. Increased venous return produces the V wave in the JVP. Okay. So when it is entering into the mitral valves open, the atrial pressure is gradually decreased. It is just above the ventricular pressure. Aortic pressure also no change. Gradually ventricular filling is increases. Ventricular volume is increases due to the rapid filling. It increases. Okay. So it produces a fourth heart sound due to the inflow of the blood from the atrium to the ventricular produces the rapid filling. And the last stage is the reduced filling or diastasis. It is the last stage. Here no change in the aortic pressure and ventricular pressure. Atrial pressure is just above that. No change in the aortic blood flow. That ventricular volume is gradually increases. the end of the reduced filling or diastasis, P wave is appear. P wave correspond to the atrial systole, end of the reduced filling. So this is the summary of the whole cardiac cycle. With this graph you can write all the phases separately. Okay, so this chart is very important. Summary of cardiac cycle. Cardiac cycle is the cycle of events occurring during each single beat. So average duration of the cardiac cycle is the 0.8 second. Atrial systole is the 0.1 second. It is important for passive filling of the ventricle. It is only contribute the 20% of the passive filling. Atrial diastole is coincide with the ventricular systole. Ventricular systole again divided into the isovolumetric contraction, rapid ejection phase and reduced ejection phase. Ventricular diastole is again divided into the isovolumetric relaxation phase, rapid filling phase and reduced filling phase or diastasis. So in this cardiac cycle you go to draw the pressure volume curve with JVP, heart sound, ECG waveforms. You go to explain the each phases of the cardiac cycle. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, share your friends. Those who are not subscribed this channel, please subscribe. Thank you once again.